Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am finally here for my LEC Week 1 overview, analysis, and of course, at the end, my updated power rankings. Finally, time to get into some LEC action. They are the last region of the major regions to start, and I, for one, am incredibly excited to see some of these teams back in action. Of course, you know, the LCS gave them a little bit of a run for their money in terms of timing, just because of the walkout, but still, LEC is going to be the final Week 1 video that I end up posting on this channel, and so I'm excited to finally get into it. Let me know what you guys were thinking about Week 1 down in the comments section below. You know I love to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback. Of course, be courteous about it. Conversations are much more important than just, you know, screaming your opinion at one another, but without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. If you're new here, what we do is go game by game, talking about all 15 games in the LEC in week number 1, giving a player of the game, a dud of the game, and then, of course, at the end of the week, I'll be giving my updated power rankings, as well as a player of the week and a dud of the week for all of week number 1. So, without further ado, let's jump right into day number 1. We kicked off the LEC split with a really fun matchup between Mad Lions and Team Vitality, and Mad Lions was able to come out on top. I got quite a bit of pushback for having Mad Lions at number 2, a lot more than I expected to get, to be entirely honest. This team has been hyper-consistent, in my opinion, over the course of the year. Yes, they did struggle in the regular season in Spring Split, but I think a lot of that was just figuring out how they wanted to play in that specific meta against some of those specific teams. They were trying out a lot of new things. They were trying to give Niski a lot more control of the team in terms of resources, and I just don't think it was the playstyle they ended up wanting to stick with. I think they went back to Elyoya being a primary carry for this team, and they proved that that style means that they can beat pretty much everybody in the league, at least relatively up and down. And you know what? That was the case here again in game number 1. Vitality is not a pushover team by any means. They were a top 4 team last split, even if they were relatively inconsistent themselves, and we know the talent is there, but Mad made them look pretty bad in this game, especially at the top side of the map. My player of the game is going to go to Chasey in the top lane. He just was phenomenal for Mad Lions, and honestly, it's becoming a trend. I feel like I continuously underrate him in terms of what he's been able to do, but he's really been, I don't want to say a best of 5 merchant, but he's been really good in terms of what he's been able to put out in best of 5s and in long series, and hasn't necessarily shown that same kind of consistency in the regular season. Now, he's kicking off the regular season in Summer Split here really well, which is a great sign for this team overall, especially going into a player like Photon, who I have a ton of immense respect for, but you know, we're going to have to see him be able to keep it up. I feel pretty confident that he's a very good player at this level. The question isn't that. The question is, can he be the number 1 top laner in the LEC? He's shown flashes of the answer to that being yes, but again, if he continues to do this over the course of the split, I'm going to feel pretty confident in that. Elyoya and Niski were good again, big shocker. They continue to be very consistent as a jungle mid duo when they play their style. Elyoya on a little bit more of a facilitator in the Gragas, but of course Gragas can still do a lot, and he honestly jungled circles around Bo this game. Bo had no pressure, he had no marks, he had nothing. We'll talk about him in a bit, but Elyoya doing his job as the number 1 jungler in the LEC, in my opinion. Niski's been fantastic. Had a little bit of a down split in spring, but again, I think it was because he was playing a style that he wasn't particularly comfortable with. It feels like he's getting back into the groove of things now with the rest of this team, and honestly, they're all looking good right now. There are almost no bad things I can say about the Mad Lions, especially this top side. Bot lane was a little bit of a question mark in terms of roster construction, but I think they've worked together relatively well, and when your top side's winning like this, it's not really going to matter what your bot lane does, to be entirely honest. And then for Vitality on the other side, my dud of the game is going to go to Bo in the jungle. I think you could realistically give this to Photon in the top lane as well. Both were pretty bad in this game and got gapped by their opponents, but Bo to me was, I think, a little bit more noticeable. He really just has these games every once in a while. He is such an aggressive player, somebody who is going to risk the game, is going to be a little bit more feast or famine in terms of the early and mid-game decisions that he ends up making, and sometimes they're just not going to pay off. And when they don't pay off, I mean, he is like useless as a player. Everything that I've said about Malrang in the past, crank that up to like 10, where he'll take major risks in the early game. If they work, he looks like the best jungler in the league. If they don't work, it looks like he should not even be playing League of Legends at a bronze level. Like, it is atrocious how bad it can go for Bo, and unfortunately, we kind of saw one of those. We just kind of know who he is at this point. Incredibly highs and incredibly low lows. And then for Photon on the other side, just, again, not very good. Not outplayed by Chasey. The Gwen wasn't particularly relevant. Ended up, I believe, getting solo killed in lane. just things you don't really want to see from a player that I think has been really good over the course of this year, and honestly has been the most consistent player for Vitality. The good for Vitality in this game honestly came from Perks in the mid lane, who was very active on the Ahri, a couple of really nice plays coming in from him. I think if he had a little bit more support in terms of damage, this could have been good, but look at this comp. I mean, there's no engage, there's no frontline, there's no anything. You're just kind of hoping that everybody individually wins, and unfortunately, that kind of comp is pretty easily exploited by Mad. Now, it wasn't even the comp's fault because a lot of these guys ended up losing 1v1, especially in the top side, but they really didn't have a lot of tools to get back in the game either. Upset and Kaiser were fine as well, but really this was the top side of the map kind of collapsing and folding for Vitality and causing major problems for them. But for Mad, congratulations on their first win. They still look really good. Starting off the season 1-0 is nice, and I think this is one step closer to kind of shutting out all the doubters and all the people who said that them winning Spring Split and them getting finals and Winter Split were anomalies. I don't think they're anomalies, and I think this team is out to prove that. And then moving on to our second game here of day at number 1, and it's a really interesting battle between two teams that I had close in the power rankings. We had Team Heretics taking on SK Gaming, and Heretics pick up the win. It was a little bit divisive for a little bit of this game. Going into Zeri Yuumi is always going to be at least a little bit of a challenge in team fights, but Team Heretics honestly was just the better team in this one, so they were able to come out on top, which is incredibly impressive. Basically exactly what we could have wanted to see out of this Heretics team, and mostly from the players that I think we wanted to see it out of early on. We knew that Yankos was probably going to be fine. He was the member that I think most people felt the most confident about, but we wanted to see how the new additions, the two new additions in particular in VTO and Flakked, would perform, and I think both of them had very good games in this one. My player of the game is pretty obviously going to go to Flakked. This is about as good of a re-debut as you could possibly have. The dude has been absolutely tearing up the ERLs on Heretics' ERL team, and really I was very excited when he was getting another chance here. Not that I hated Jack Spectra, I just thought he was probably the most inconsistent AD carry in the LEC up until this point this year, was certainly the one I think with the most to prove, and Flakked had been really proving it in the ERLs, and so for him to get the chance and then for him to show up and just be fantastic basically from moment one, it's not surprising, but it is really good to see. Hopefully he's going to be able to keep this up. I know maybe, he got a lot of hate, a lot of flack, pun intended, if you will, last year on G2. Just because of the situation, he was often given that weak side bot lane and basically just told to survive on things like Seraphine or, similar picks. And, he never really got the spotlight. When he was able to get a lot of resources, he was a pretty good AD carry. I thought, him and Targamas going their separate ways was going to be better for both of them. It hasn't necessarily been that way for Targamas, but Flakked has definitely re-emerged in 2023 as an AD carry that you have to watch out for. Merso was also fantastic in this game, by the way. Milio is one of those champions where it should be obvious to see him perform at a very high level, but we've really seen a lot of players not play Milio well, even in really good regions, and so good to see Mersa continue to step up. Like I said, him and VTO getting back together I think is secretly going to be a very good thing for Heretics. They had phenomenal chemistry on Misfits last year, and I think that should translate to this team. So good stuff overall. VTO making his debut here for Heretics. This was a really good showing from him. Going into Certus, who isn't exactly the toughest mid laner in the region to face, but I have a lot of confidence that VTO is going to have a much better split than he had been having recently on Excel. I feel like the team atmosphere is a lot better. I think the players around him are a lot more cohesive. And I think it's really going to play into his strengths as a player, which is basically every part of the game. He can win early, he can win late. It's just about what he ends up dedicating his playstyle to. Yankos was good. Evie was solid on the top side as the Scion, not necessarily being that weak link that he kind of was over the course of Spring Split. So everybody on Heretics looking pretty good so far. As for SK, not the best start to the split. It feels like this team has been on a perpetual downswing ever since the end of Winter Split, which is pretty disappointing. I know a lot of people are going to want to see me give dud of the game to Exakick because he did make quite a few mistakes on the Zeri in the late game, but I would argue that the only reason they were in that game in the first place was because of Exakick up until that point with some of the aggressive plays that he was making. I'm going to give dud of the game to Doss, and I know that may seem weird on the Yuumi because really, like, how much of a game impact can he have, but he really needed to be a little bit more, I don't know, a little bit more in this game. I really needed to see more healing, more shielding, more blocking, just a little bit more active play coming out from Dawson. That's something that we've criticized him for in the past, not necessarily in the Winter Split, but it was certainly at least a little bit of a problem last split where him and Exakick weren't doing as well in lane because it felt like they were significantly more passive in terms of their ideology. They weren't getting as much pressure coming in from Marcoon, and it felt like SK just kind of, that was the version that we saw today, which is very disappointing because I do think this team has upside to be very, very good, but Exakick with a couple couple of mistakes down the stretch. Doss not having a particularly good game. Certus not necessarily looking as good as VTO across the lane from him. Irrelevant being relatively irrelevant on the Gragas. And then Marcoon having some moments on the Kha'Zix. But again, you need to really get that pick snowballing because he's not going to have nearly as much utility as a pick like Wukong on the other side of the map. And SK just didn't really have the gold to be able to facilitate the playstyle that they were ending up looking for. So overall, I just think that they're fine. They might be a bottom 2 team considering the fact that a lot of teams in the LEC are going to start to level up, but they still do have a lot of talent. And I still think Execute can carry this team to quite a few wins this split. And then for Heretics on the other side, they look really good, at least in their first test. Yes, it's against SK, so I don't want to overreact, but Yankos was a man just trying his best last split, and it feels like he finally has help. VTO, Flak, and Mursa definitely stepped up in this first game. If they can continue to do that throughout the rest of the split, this is going to be a relatively dangerous team. And then moving on to our third game of day number 1. Another really fun game in and of itself, even if the matchup it was a little bit lopsided. We had Koi taking on Excel, and Koi does pick up the win, as they absolutely should in this circumstance. They should be the better team out of these two, and they absolutely were, which is a really good thing to see. Again, we wanted to see Koi be able to come out and prove that, you know, their changes this offseason weren't going to be as big a deal as some people predicted. I know I read a lot of people, not only in my comment section, but especially on Reddit and on Twitter, you know, in other YouTube comment sections that were very concerned about this Koi team with the loss of Trimby, with AdVN coming in and replacing him. They thought Comp in particular was really going to struggle this split because he really was already not playing at his usual level this point this year, and losing a really good support in Trimby was, you know, only going to exacerbate that, I think, in a lot of people's minds. But for me, I thought that distance would probably do them good. They weren't particularly good together this year. Comp was pretty bad in winter, and then Trimby followed that up with a really bad spring, and so just kind of getting a new bot lane in there I thought would be relatively interesting for Koi, which is why I had them so high in my power rankings, number 5. And so far, so good. In game number 1, I know it's against Excel, but the bot lane looked fantastic. Comp is going to get my player of the game here for Koi. He was just phenomenal. On the Xayah, some sort of CS hack, he was at like 200 CS at 20 minutes, which first of all is awesome, but then at 30 minutes, he's at like 400 CS, and then all of a sudden, he's dealing a bajillion damage because he's completely full build, and he completely steamrolls the game. It was really good stuff coming in from him. This very much felt like old Comp. I honestly want to say like 2020, 2021 Comp, like Vitality Comp, if I'm being entirely honest, where he would play with Labrov and be relatively inactive in the early game, but scale up into the late game and be a big menace. That's kind of what he was this game, and I get why, because he's going into something like the Draven, which you just don't want to get online. Credit to Patrick. I actually think he played this game really well, and we'll talk about him a bit more when we get to the Excel side, but Comp was really, really good. Definitely the difference maker in a lot of these team fights, and Patrick definitely made some mistakes in this game as well, but Comp was the carry, and Koi should definitely thank him for being as good as he was. AdVN was fine on the Yuumi. He just had to play Yuumi. It doesn't necessarily need a ridiculous amount of execution, but the rest of this team wasn't exactly the most consistent. Shigenda in the top lane had a couple of problems. Certainly wasn't a perfect game from him. Malrang really didn't do anything on the Jarvan pick. That's something that obviously he's been very active in pulling out in the past, but really didn't look all that great in this game. And Larson was fine, I guess. He certainly made some plays and was definitely the better mid laner in this game, but really this was about Comp. This was Comp carrying Koi across the finish line, and that's got to actually be a pretty good thing to see. I have faith that Shigenda and Larson in particular are going to be fine, and Malrang game to game is always going to be relatively, you know, unexpected. You don't really know what you're going to get out of him. But, you know, if Comp is able to step up and be that big focal point carry for this team, I think that's going to solve a lot of the issues that they were facing earlier on in the year. So good stuff from them. And then for Excel on the other side, some good, actually. You know, this team doesn't show good very often, but there was good in this game. Ottawamne, I thought, played relatively well, especially towards the back half of that game on the Gnar. He was saving a lot of team fights with that Gnar pick and really trying to keep the game alive, but ultimately it just wasn't going to be. Peach, I thought, looked relatively good, especially initiating in the back half of the game on the Wukong. Wasn't necessarily a great early game, though, and that's something that I think we're going to have to keep monitoring. Excel has not had a good early game all year, and there were some concerns about how Peach was going to be able to communicate with the rest of the players on this team. Game number 1's not exactly going to alleviate any of those fears for me, but the big standouts are Ottawamne, like I said, and then Patrick, who I thought had a lot of really good moments in this game on the Draven. Not necessarily the most consistently perfect game. I think he could have done a lot more damage, but there really wasn't a lot of setup in the back half of these fights. The Gnar, the Wukong, they were good for going in, but the Rakan was certainly not. Limit did not have a very good game, and so Patrick was often just trying to make things of his own, and there was really no peel, and so he would blow up very quickly in team fights with that short-range Draven. Often there was not a lot he could do, and And then dud of the game for me is going to go to Abadage, just really bad. In the mid lane, his positioning is atrocious. This is kind of just the Excel curse. The mid lane position has not been good for them all year long, and that seems like it's going to carry over into, unfortunately, Summer Split, which is very not good for Excel. But whether it was VTO, whether it was Abadage, nobody's really been able to perform all that well in that role this year. Game number 1, I'm not going to completely write him off, because Abadage's had bad games in the past. He's had bad stretches, even in seasons where he's done relatively well, and so I want to give him some time to gel with the team, especially because Peach is a new jungler, and jungle mid is a very important duo right now. But game number 1 was not exactly the most encouraging thing for Abadage, especially in those late game team fights where it really did feel like Excel actually had some potential to win. And so this team looks okay. Again, it's hard for me to know because they've looked okay in the past, but they've never been able to consistently look okay. So one game's great. We're going to have to see if they're going to be able to do it for more than one game. And then for Koi on the other side, they look solid. Again, I'm not going to overreact and say this team is fantastic. I'm certainly not going to overreact and say they're bad because they didn't destroy Excel or anything like that. Comp looked really good. I think him and AdVN should have pretty decent chemistry together. Shigen and Larson I expect to be relatively good, and Malrang's always going to be a little bit hit or miss, but when you get that hit, it's going to be fine. So Koi looking about as good as you could want them to here. And then moving on to our 4th game of day number 1, and this is a top-of-the-table clash. Really excited to get this on the first day. We had G2 Esports taking on Team BDS, and G2 is able to pick up the victory in this one. Unfortunately, the Euphoria tier list was off just a little bit, and BDS being the only team in S tier. Not looking great on the first day. Again, it's just the first day. I don't want to overreact. Best of ones can be so finicky, but G2 still looking really good, and honestly, there was a reason I continued to put them at number 1 in my tier list, and it's because when they're at their best, they are the best team in the league. Like, if they're on form, if their players are playing well, they're the best team in the LEC, and I don't think it's particularly close. And I think we saw a little bit of that this game, a couple of ups and downs, I would say, but they were definitely the better team in this one. They just out-macroed BDS into oblivion, which I think really gave them a massive advantage. But my player of the game is going to pretty obviously go to Broken Blade on the top side. He was fantastic. I know a lot of BB people out there hate him nowadays. It's funny because it felt like I was on the anti-Broken Blade train for so long, from like 2018 or 2019, whenever he joined TSM, all the way up to his years on Schalke, the year before he joined G2, I was like, man, I'm just out on Broken Blade. I don't think he's very good. I think he takes too many resources to be efficient, and I think he really halts the progress of the rest of the team. And everybody's like, no, you're crazy. He's actually really talented. Haven't you seen him carry this game? And I'm like, yeah, he got 45 ganks and every single lane CS. Of course he carried the game, but then he goes to G2 and he learns how to play weak side, and he's actually really efficient at it, and it really feels like he's adjusted his mental. And now people are like, oh, I hate Broken Blade, he's so inefficient, he doesn't really do all these things. And I'm like, how are you saying that now? He's gotten so much better and he's gotten so much more consistent. Of all the times to make fun of Broken Blade, it's after he got all better. Like, it just feels like sometimes the league community just wants to be contrarian, and I think obviously playing for G2 is going to put a little bit more of a microscope onto your actions, but Broken Blade's been really good for this team. Easily one of the best top laners in the league over the course of the last 2 years. Probably the most consistent LEC top laner last year and this year if you combine the both years. Really just good stuff overall from Broken Blade, and he was great in this game. He continuously was going mid lane to help out Caps, who was getting perma-ganked because that's just what teams do against G2, and the Renekton got super fed, and by the time we hit the late game, no one was really able to stop him. Look at the other comp. There's just not enough damage to be able to shred through that Renekton if he's fed. So good stuff from Broken Blade. I thought Yike was pretty good as well, especially getting objectives. That was a really important part for G2 in this game, but also, of course, he probably could have helped Caps out a bit more in the mid lane, helped him survive a bit more. Caps was fine on his own, but it was pretty funny how much attention they were putting into him. And then Mickey X, I mean, the dude got a triple kill and then built Magi's on Nami. Like, that should go to show you where he was at in this game. Mickey played pretty fantastic. I actually really like Magi's on Nami. I think it's a really funny item to end up buying. It gives you basically everything you want, but him and Hans continue to be very good. I still think he's the better version of that bot lane, or the better partner in that bot lane, but Hans is a very good player as well, even if he'll never get Draven again. And like I said, Caps was perma-ganked, so there really wasn't a lot that he could do to kind of spread the wealth in this game, but G2 looking really, really strong, basically everywhere on the map. BDS, as for them, not so good. Their macro looked pretty bad in this game. It felt like they had a game plan going into the game, and then once that didn't work, they had no backup plan, which is certainly at least a little bit concerning. And then the map basically just lost 1v1 or 2v2, which is always going to be at least a little bit of a problem. My dud of the game is going to go to Adam. Adam in the top lane, but I think you could very realistically give this to Nuke in the mid lane as well. Both of the solo laners not playing particularly well. I gave it to Adam because it felt like the Malphite did nothing this game. Like, he was hitting like a wet noodle. The knockups weren't actually mattering in team fights. Like, there was just no point to having that champion. Renekton was roaming around the map after shoving in because he had so much pressure on the top side. And so, yeah, Adam was basically an NPC, a bot this game, and that's never going to be a good thing. And then Nuke was also really bad. Got actually a ton of attention from his team and turned it into basically nothing. And so the solo laners are going to have to get better. I was worried about Nuke going into the split, saying maybe it is going to be a case of regression coming in from him because, you know, he looked really good when the rest of the team looked good, but he's just never been a consistent mid lane player at the LEC level before the spring split, so that was something to keep in mind. And then Adam's always going to have some bad games here and there. Usually it's not him being irrelevant. Usually it's him running it down, but this game just wasn't very good. Sheo got out jungled by Yike. It's going to happen every once in a while. I'm not going to blame Sheo entirely, although I do think he should have adjusted his game plan. And Crowny and Lebrov were fine. I guess Lebrov actually had some good plays. He continuously tried to block Maokai ultimate, but his team was just stubborn and wanted to take it anyways, I guess, in a lot of these team fights, but just a little bit over aggression in terms of some of these engages, especially around objectives, that they probably should have just given up in the first place. And so BDS definitely having some problems, but, you know, it's against G2. Hopefully they'll be able to bounce back. And then G2 actually looking really fantastic against a good team here in BDS. A great way to start the split and a great way to follow up on MSI. And then moving on to our fifth and final game here of day number 1. And I know a lot of people were really looking forward to this one because it's the debut of a very new look Fnatic as we saw them taking on Astralis. And Fnatic does pick up the rather dominant victory in this one. And I gotta say, I was low on this team. I was worried about the consistency, especially at the start of the split. And really, there were just a lot of good teams in the LEC that I didn't have as many question marks about. But man, Fnatic's upside showed itself in game number 1 here, and they showed why people were really excited about what this roster could put together. Basically, everyone stepped up and started to play well. I was talking about a couple of things that I really needed to see happen from Fnatic in week number 1 in order to feel more confident about their potential success throughout the rest of the split, and basically all of it happened. Every single question mark, at least in game number 1, felt pretty damn good against an Astralis team that honestly is solid. Like, I know that on paper their talent level is overperforming right now, and they're not necessarily, you know, expected to be like a top, 5 or 6 team every single split, but they have been up until this point. And so to see Fnatic be able to take them down, especially in this bot lane matchup, I think is very, very impressive stuff. So let's go ahead and talk about it. My player of the game is going to go to Trimby. Comp getting player of the game earlier in the day. Trimby getting it now for Fnatic. Like I said, one thing that I was very vocal about in my video, my pre-split video, my pre-summer video, was that I think the separation of Comp and Trimby was actually going to be good for them both. And so far, that looks like a good take. That looks like it is absolutely right. Trimby comes into Fnatic here, gets one game of Thresh, and is just utterly unstoppable, was landing hooks left and right. Perfect engages, great disengage. That's really what Trimby, I think, does at a super high level, is play for peel and make sure his AD carry looks really good. And man, did he do that in this game. It was just everything you could have possibly wanted out of a Thresh and then some. And so really, really good game from him. If he's going to be able to keep up that kind of performance throughout the rest of the split, Fnatic is going to be the team that we all kind of feared. And, I was already saying that Trimby was the player that I was the least concerned about going into the split, which is wild considering how much I dogged on him last split. But, he was the player I ranked the highest, and it was for good reason. He is really good. But him and Noah actually looked fantastic. I'm going to say it. Noah did not show this on Zero Tenacity. He was a good player, and that team was really successful, but the level of positioning, like, excellence that he showed in this game was just not something that I saw on tape, and that's okay. Like, if you're going to be able to play at a higher level with better players around you, that's a really good thing to know. But really, I mean, this is shocking how perfect he was in this game when it comes to positioning both early and late. I mean, playing exactly on the edge of danger as that Aphelios. I think, obviously, having something like a Thresh that can bail you out if you're in a bad situation probably helps the mental, but still, really impressive stuff coming out from Noah. Humanoid had a phenomenal game on LeBlanc. That champion is a little bit busted right now because of the static shiv, just changes in general and the way that that item works, but Humanoid still piloted it at a really high level, and him and Razork were really on the same page. We'll get to Razork now, I guess. He was definitely the better jungler in this game. His scoreline is, I think, a little bit inflated by some of the setups, but still, really good game coming out from him. And Oscar, it was revealed in the post-game lounge that he was actually the main shot caller for a lot of these team fights, and if that's the case, like, these team fights were ridiculously well coordinated in terms of follow-up engages, whether it was Oscar going in and then immediately Trimby following up, or whether it was, Trimby going in and Oscar being frontline, or Razort going in, or LeBlanc going in and getting poked down. Whoever it was, like, the fact that Oscar is really, like, stepping into more of a vocal leadership role on this team, I think is scary for teams that aren't Fnatic. Everybody on this team showed fantastic things in game number 1, and really, I think a lot of the positives that you could say about Fnatic in the preseason showed up here, but for Astralis, not so much. They didn't look great in this game. They kind of got blasted, especially towards the back half. Couple of good moments. I thought Finn actually was pretty good in this game on the Renekton, was certainly trying to keep things alive, had a decent early game laning phase, and just wasn't able to translate it into a team comp that was built to team fight towards the back half of the game, which makes sense, but basically everybody else on the map lost. 113 is going to get my dud of the game in the jungle. It felt like none of the Wukong engages this game were good. He was playing on the back foot for 90% because he lost so hard early, and doing that into a Viego and into an Aphelios, it just makes that Wukong significantly less useful. Leader on Annie is not leader on Aurelia. That is something that is definitely the case, and we're probably going to see, those champions banned relatively frequently against him. I was already worried about him going into the split because it felt like he regressed towards the back half of last split, but this was even more of a concern. And then Kabe and Jonghoon, I thought, were just outclassed by Noah and Trimby, especially towards the back half of the game where Noah and Trimby were significantly better team fighters. And so overall, not a great game for Astralis, but it was against a very fired up Fnatic team who might be a lot better than I was giving them credit for. So I'm going to give them a little bit of a pass. Again, it's a best of one. I'm willing to let, a team lose a best of one and not freak out. But for Fnatic, you showed everything you needed to show in this first game. It's really just going to be about if you can keep it up. Razork and Humanoid need to stay on the same page. Oscar needs to show that week 3 last split wasn't an outlier, and Noah and Trimby, if they play like this the whole split, this team is for sure going to be in contention for top 4. And now we get to jump into day number 2 here in week number 1, and day 2 kicked us off with a matchup between Team Vitality and SK Gaming. And Vitality does pick up the win here, which is really crucial. If this team fell to 0-2, I was going to get very, very concerned. Again, it's really hard to tell, especially watching recently the LPL and the LCK, how good teams are in best of ones, knowing how often bad teams win the game number 1 in the best of ones in those regions and then go on to get clapped the rest of the series. But, Vitality not going 0-2 to start the split, I think is a really good thing for them. We'll get to SK in a bit, but basically any form that they had in Winter is gone. This is one of the worst teams in the league, and I feel pretty confident in saying that at this point, unfortunately for them. But fortunately for Vitality, they're able to pull it out. They end up getting a couple of really strong picks in particular, most notably my player of the game, Perks, on that LeBlanc. This pick is just absolutely nutty right now. It is actually absurd how much damage this thing does. I don't know why it's not pick or ban for a lot of other teams. Like, I understand the strength of things like Zeri, and I know people complain about that, and I understand the strength of, like, Nico, and maybe even Milio, or Yumi, or Cassante, or things in that vein, right, that I think a lot of people complain about. But to me, honestly, like, LeBlanc is the scariest thing in the game right now at the pro level. It just feels like it's an auto win every single time it's played. I would much rather face a Zeri where you still have to execute than a LeBlanc where all you have to do is jump in and you're dealing a quarter of the AD carry's health just by proxy damage. And so, maybe that's just me complaining a little bit too much about the item. It's getting nerfed, so we shouldn't have to see it for too long. But Perks was really good in this game, and the ability to use it at a very high level was the reason Vitality was able to walk away with such a clean win. Now, obviously, one major mistake from Perks, and it's going to happen every single game. He's going to have one major int moment, but it's fine, dude. He's just making up for the fact that he absolutely destroyed them on super broken LeBlanc, and so good for him. Perks has been the best member across the first 2 games. Again, only 2 games, but something to keep in mind. Photon had a really nice bounce back game. I thought he was really good on the Renekton. Upset's reaction time and his mechanics are just inhuman. That flash ult from Certus coming in on the Annie from vision, or like from no vision, by the way, completely blind, completely in the dark. Certus flash ults Upset, and he somehow flash avoids it. It's like, how do you have that kind of reaction speed? That is like milliseconds of reaction speed. Completely insane there from Upset. And again, it just goes to show the mechanical prowess that he has and why I think a lot of us believe that he can and should be one of the best AD carries in the world. Like, he really should be that, but, the consistency is always going to be a question mark, even if I do think that it's more consistent than people give him credit for. Bo was on the Sejuani, and that's typically going to be at least a little bit better. I think the ups and downs are going to be a little bit less there on things like that, but allow players like Photon and Perks and Upset to be able to carry you across the finish line. And they're going to do so. Unfortunately for Vitality, though, My dud of the game is actually going to stay on their team. It's going to go to Kaiser on this Nautilus. I think SK was definitely the worst team, but I couldn't pinpoint really one player that I think was making a ridiculous amount of mistakes. You know, we'll talk about Certus in a bit, who I think definitely made quite a few, but Kaiser was probably the most noticeable in terms of negative plays this game. And so for me, he's going to get dud of the game. A lot of those Nautilus hooks were just straight up bad. I mean, he had a team to be able to back him up, and so a lot of those plays ended up turning into something that could be fine. But I'm going to be honest, I'm a little bit worried about Kaiser. It's just not been a very good year for him so far, and maybe he'll hit, maybe he'll be able to turn it around. He's a really talented player who has been very consistently great for a long time, and these two bot lane players are both really good, but Kaiser's easily having the worst year, I would say, of his professional career in 2023, and that is at least something to keep an eye on. He's had some good games here and there. I've definitely talked about those. I think his negatives are getting a little bit too pointed out, but this was not a very good game from him. It didn't really matter, though. Vitality was definitely better, and they were able to grab the win. And then for SK, like I said, they're just not one of the best teams in the league anymore. They're not really a team that I would expect to be able to compete at the highest level. I still really like Exakick, and there were moments in this game where he still looks good on the Jinx. Doss, I think, looked a lot better on the Rakan than he did on the Yuumi, but top side of this map, and especially the jungle mid duo, was just not very active and not very good in this game. Certus had some moments where he was, at least trying to make plays on the Annie, like I said, that flash ultimate, but a lot of those plays ended up not working out, and honestly, he really didn't do anything this game. If I was gonna give it to anybody on the side of SK, it would probably be Certus in the mid lane, even though he led the team in kills. And then Marcoon in the jungle, again, just very inactive. Once Vitality got their lead, he really just didn't do anything. He kind of just sat there and let the enemy team win the game. And I understand as Maokai, it can be relatively difficult to force plays, but at some point, you got to try something. When you've got Maokai, Ornn, Jinx, like, clearly if you go relatively even into some of these team fights, it's going to be a lot easier against Renekton, Xayah, LeBlanc. Like, the 5v5 should be in your favor as SK, and it just didn't feel like they ever identified that as an avenue for them to be able to pick up a victory. Irrelevant was fine. Like I said, Exakick still shows very good mechanics, even if the rest of the team isn't following up on a lot of the plays he's making. I just don't think SK has that, like, X factor anymore. They just feel like a team, and that is very frustrating. And then for Vitality, like I said, on the other side, they're good. They're solid. I still need to see more out of them. Beating SK is fine, but the inconsistency of this team is absolutely still there, and if they want to stay a top 4 team, they've got to show a lot more than just this one win. And then moving on to our second game of day number 2 here, and it's a British matchup, the Brexit Brawl, or whatever people are calling it nowadays. We have Excel taking on Fnatic, and Fnatic does get the job done to move to 2-0 this week. Obviously, not quite as impressive as taking down Astralis, but I think you could argue this team looked just as good in this game as they did on day number 1, and man, is that an encouraging sight, because if this Fnatic team is clicking on all cylinders, if they are really rocking, it is going to be very difficult to take them down. We know that this team has talent, and clearly even some of the pieces that I was less comfortable with in terms of mechanics have just been completely overhauled, are just way better than I was giving them credit for, but everybody on this team looks to be playing some of the best League that they have played in a little while. Again, very small sample size. It's only 2 games, so I don't want to overreact, but man, it's been 2 really freaking good games, and so I do want to give them the credit that they deserve. My player of the game, pretty obviously going to go to Noah in the bot lane. The new player coming in here from Zero Tenacity, obviously formerly of LCK Challengers, just a really, really, really talented player. I didn't see this, and maybe I just missed it, but usually, like, mechanics are pretty easy to spot. You can tell when someone's playing well, mechanically speaking, and Noah just wasn't this guy on Zero Tenacity. Obviously, he had mechanics. He was always a very good player, but these aren't very good mechanics. These are, like, pixel-perfect mechanics. He has stepped up into almost immediately becoming one of the more mechanically adept AD carries in the entire league, and I think, pairing him with someone like Trimby, who is notably known for being a shot caller and being a really good playmaker and decision maker for, Koi and Rogue over the past few years. I think that is an unreal thing to have a pairing of for Fnatic if they're able to both kind of level up in that way. It's really worked out so far. Noah has been fantastic on Aphelios. Really, the only question mark that you can have about him as a player up until this point is, can he do it on champions that aren't Aphelios? Because, again, he's only played Aphelios through the first 2 games, but apparently it's his lowest win rate AD carry in scrims, and so, I don't know, I trust this guy a lot now. It's very quickly turned into, oh, Noah's actually fantastic. It's not really up for debate, like he's going to be a top 3, AD carry in the league by the end of the year. Got it, I understand now, because his mechanics are absurd, and if he's got teammates that are helping him out with the macro portion, that's going to be fantastic. But Trimby's a big help for that. Decent game of Yuumi. I mean, you can only have such a good game. We've seen what happens when you have a bad game of Yuumi, though, and so Trimby having a good one here is solid, but him and Noah, I think more notable as the duo rather than individually, in my opinion. And then Razork, who's had a really good start to the split, this time on Kindred, playing more of that frontline Kindred style, which is a very fun thing to watch. Him be super aggressive on that pick and continue to try and make advantages for the team. He was face-checking basically every brush, which is pretty insane. You don't really do that on Kindred very often, but this team was far ahead enough to be able to pull it off, and that Kindred was definitely dealing enough damage to be able to make it not worth anybody's while to try and check him in that brush, and especially try to blow him up before he can press that ultimate. So, good stuff overall from those 3 players. I think they were the standouts. Oscar still good on the Cassante, Humanoid good on the Annie. Just overall, Fnatic looking really solid, especially this bot lane, who honestly kind of look like superstars at the current moment. And then for Excel on the other side, this team is just not very good. They're the worst team in the league. I don't really know what to tell you. They're just going to get run over, I think. None of their communication in the early game has been solved by any of the changes that they've made. Peach coming in, obviously, I don't think was supposed to fix that part of the game, but Limit, I think, was definitely brought in as a shot caller, as somebody who was supposed to direct traffic a little bit better. This team just has no idea how to play the mid game. Like, they just have no concept of it. And individually, a lot of these players are just losing as well. My dud of the game is going to go to Abadage again in the mid lane. It just feels like he's consistently not active on the map, and that in the mid lane position right now is just like a death sentence. You need to be able to move around the map. You need to be able to create plays for the rest of your team, especially on a pick like Ari. Like, if Humanoid's going to be roaming with this jungler and getting numbers advantages, and Abadage is just not going to be doing that, or isn't going to be useful when he does get into fights, then it's a disaster. But he was far from the only one who didn't play well. Patrick was significantly worse in this game than he was in game number 1, in my opinion. Limit continues to be a little bit of an issue. This bot lane is not synergizing very well, especially in the 2v2 where they pretty consistently lose. Peach is just fine. He was put on Sejuani, didn't necessarily create any good plays, didn't necessarily create any bad plays. And then Otoamne was a little bit aggressive, but you kind of have to be on Renekton, especially in the early game. It was just unfortunate that the team fell behind super far. So yeah, Excel is the same team that we've known them to be. They still have a lot of talent. There still is a lot of good players on this team, but clearly none of them know how to play together as a unit, because it just feels like it's 5 dudes and not one team, which is a very unfortunate thing to say about them. But for Fnatic on the other side, they look pretty fantastic. This is a team that is probably going to skyrocket up in my power rankings this week, but 2 wins are great. But Astralis, Excel, I'm interested to see what this team is going to do once the quality of their opponent rises, but at least for now, taking care of some of the teams that are a little bit more inconsistent in the league, they look really good doing so. And then moving on to our 3rd game here of day number 2, and man, I was really excited for this one. It's a battle between the 2 teams from the LEC that just represented the region at MSI, Mad Lions taking on G2 Esports. And Mad Lions pick up another victory over G2. It almost feels funny at this point how much these teams trade back and forth. We obviously had, Mad losing to G2 in the finals in Winter Split, which was a really, a decently fun series, I should say. Wasn't exactly the most close, G2 definitely being dominant there, but Mad getting their revenge in the playoffs to knock G2 out in spring, and then they go on to win the split, and so good stuff overall. G2 gets their win back at MSI in that best of 5, and then Mad Lions obviously now showing that G2 really doesn't have the full advantage of these 2 teams. It's just really good stuff from Mad Lions, and a lot of people continue to doubt this team. But man, you're making a mistake to doubt this team. They've now beaten both Vitality and G2 in the opening week. That's a pretty damn strong start to the split. For all the people that are talking about how Mad is going to eventually underperform their expectations, that they will fall back down to earth, I just don't think that that is going to happen. There was a reason I ranked them at number 2, and honestly, after this win, they might even go higher. This was a really, really damn good showing from Mad Lions. Player of the game is going to go to Chasey again in the top lane. Really, really good start to the season from him. He's just been so explosive out of that top lane matchup, most notably in the 1v1s, but man, can he team fight. Like, he's just a really well-rounded top laner, and again, I know the LEC is a little bit of a different beast than the ERLs, and you can't always compare performance in the ERLs to the LEC, but some players that just weren't superstars or didn't exactly show the tape in the ERLs that they show at the LEC level continue to pop up, because Chasey really is that. I remember going into the year being like, he's probably going to be the weakest top laner in the league. He didn't really have a lot of great tape in the ERLs. He was just kind of an okay player in an okay league, and I wasn't super jazzed about him going to a Mad Lions team that clearly wanted to win this year, but man, was I wrong. He's arguably been the most important piece to this team, especially in big games, and so big credit to Chasey. He continues to play at a very high level. Elyoya is fantastic, but want to give a big shout out to Carzzy and Hylissang, who were really good in this game and have been really good through the first two games for them. Going into Hansama and Mickey is certainly not an easy challenge, especially when they're on Lucian Nami, because the amount of pressure that lane inherently creates is just absurd, but you gotta give Carzzy and Hilly a lot of credit for being able to honestly win the 2v2, get some solo kills, or I guess duo kills in the bot lane, and just kind of be better out of the two of these. You know, Hans and Mickey definitely stepped it up in the mid game, but Carzzy and Hilly, I think, played really well in this game, and if those two can step up, I mean, Carzzy was really the only question mark I had about this team moving into this split, for them being like an upper tier, one of the best teams in the entire league kind of team. And if Carzzy's going to play like this, if he's going to be better than Hansama in lane, like that's massive. That's going to be major for this team. And so overall, really like what Mad Lions is doing. I think they look really freaking good in this game. And if they're able to keep up this kind of momentum for the rest of the split, I mean, who's to stop them from doing it again and winning Summer Split as well? But for G2, you know, a couple of errors here and there. This more so felt like a limit testing game than it really ever felt like a game between two of the best teams in the entire league. And so I don't want to punish them too much for this best of one. Going to give dud of the game to Yike in the jungle, because I really just think that he was pretty useless this entire game. There really was not a lot of good plays coming out from the Nocturne. He really just was an ultimate by the end of the game, which I know Nocturne just is, but especially in this one where it felt like Caps was the main character of G2 and they were going to live and die by this Nico's plays. He was really just waiting to press R until Caps engaged, and it was just kind of an accessory piece to what the Nico was doing, and so I wanted to see more. I wanted to see more proactivity from Yike. I wanted to see more damage coming out from him. There really was a game here for a little bit, especially with Caps being as fed as he was in the early to mid game, and it just didn't feel like Yike capitalized on that enough to really put G2 in a good position. So he's going to get my dud of the game, but of course, you got to talk about Caps in this game when it comes to G2. The dude absolutely stomped laning phase. He was super strong on the Nico, made some really flashy plays, you know, turning into a ward or turning into a minion, and then, you know, ulting in and getting some really good plays off. Just good stuff from Caps being able to utilize the Nico, but live by the Nico, die by the Nico, and eventually he overused the power. He would be turning into, you know, a vision cone or a honey fruit or something, and, you know, would try to go for these engages over and over again, and eventually Mad was like, okay, well, that's just Caps. We're just going to kill him, and this engage isn't going to go well, and now G2 just insta loses the fight. So you live by Caps, you die by Caps, you live by Nico, you die by Nico. That's just kind of how it goes here in the LEC, and that's why I said this is a little bit more of a limit testing game for them, because I think Caps certainly could have performed a lot better in the mid to late game with the kind of lead that he was able to generate. And if he did, honestly, if he was playing Nico in a more, I don't know, prudent way, like G2 very well could have won this game relatively easily, but, you know, it ended up not being the case. I think Hans and Mickey definitely rebounded from what was a rough start relatively well, especially in the mid game. Lucian can still deal a lot of damage even from behind, and then Broken Blade was fine. He was playing Poppy. He really didn't need to be this gigantic carry for the team, but Chasey was definitely better on the other side of the map. But overall, G2 looking all right. I'm not going to punish them, like I said, for this loss too hard, because it really did feel like they were just trying stuff out, and I feel like if they were to take this game a little bit more seriously, maybe in a best of 5 or in a more, you know, playoff environment, that they might even be able to walk out of it with a win. But congratulations to Mad. You start your split 2-0 after facing two of the scariest and most imposing teams in the entire league talent-wise, and you look pretty damn good doing it. Chasey looks fantastic. Carzzy and Hilly are really stepping up, and when Elyoya and Niski have been the players that we're talking about the least on the side of Mad Lions, you know that's a pretty damn good start to the split. And then moving on to our fourth game of day number 2 here, and it's another intriguing matchup. I love to see when two more interesting teams go head-to-head. You know, in the LEC, we have a lot of those, but this matchup in particular, I was kind of looking forward to. We had Koi taking on Team BDS, and BDS picks up their first win of the split here. Really good stuff. Both teams now going to 1-1, and this isn't a particularly big upset, but it is good to see BDS bounce back after what was not a perfect start to the split against G2 on day number 1. I think pretty much everybody on the team looked a lot more coherent here, but let's be honest, this entire game was centered around Adam in the top lane, and he's going to get my player of the game for BDS because of it. When he is on, when people forget to just ban out one of his main champions champions and then blind pick Cassante, he is going to absolutely destroy you. Like, I understand that, you know, Adam is a player who can be relatively volatile and that this team has, you know, wanted to go away from playing exclusively towards that top side in recent weeks, especially wanting to play more for Crownie in the bot lane, which obviously is a good idea. He's been the best AD carry in the LEC this year, but Adam is still that guy. You cannot forget about him. He was my pick for MVP last split because I really do think he was the most valuable player to his own team's success in the regular season, and that, for me, needs to be remembered. Him on Olaf, he can still absolutely destroy you. Shigenda, you know, he honestly didn't have that bad of a game. I think his negative plays are getting a little bit blown up because I think, obviously, you need to blame somebody for the enemy top laner not looking good, but Adam was all over the map. He was absolutely obliterating everybody. Malrang and Larson in particular, but Comp in the back half of this game had absolutely no power and no strength to be able to play. Adam just looked really freaking good, and this team is basically unstoppable when this top side is looking as good as they are, because Crownie and Labrov, as great as they have been as a strong side for this team, are still a fantastic weak side as well, and so you've got these two lanes, and if both of them are doing well, like, this was the reason BDS was the #1 seed in the regular season in spring, and it was because of Adam and Crownie and Labrov all stepping up, Sheo being the facilitator, and Nuke just being another, you know, I guess, I don't want to say facilitator twice, but a secondary carry, I guess, in the mid lane, and I think that's a strategy that this team went back to here, but, you know, big credit to Crownie and Labrov. They were definitely the better bot lane in this game, and I think on the Zeri Lulu, it can be relatively difficult to be that kind of weak side for this team, but I do think that they played that role very well. Crownie's positioning is just flawless, like, he really is an incredibly talented player, and Labrov is a great enchanter player, somebody who I think really excels at that part of the game. He's really good on engagers as well, just a very versatile support, but this Lulu meta, I think, has very much helped him a lot. Sheo and Nuke are still solid. Like them as a duo. I think Sheo is a little bit more explosive as a player, and I think we kind of saw a little bit of that on the Gragas in this series, but really when you're looking at BDS in this game, the conversation is going to start and end with conversations about Adam. And then Koi on the other side, unfortunate that you kind of go down in this one relatively easily. You got Adam, right? Like, it's going to happen every once in a while, but my dead of the game is going to go to Comp in the bot lane. He really didn't get a chance to play at all. He really needed to step up and be a lot better in the early game. I think that was really going to be his avenue to get online, but as a Felios, it can be a little bit difficult to do that. You are going into a rather isolated Zeri Lulu, and so I can see a world in which you could have played a little bit more aggro, but Comp didn't, and I think it really came back to bite him when we got to the mid and late game where he just didn't have the power to actually be able to deal with any of the frontline threats on the side of BDS, so Comp giveth and Comp taketh away. I kind of talked about this over the course of this year so far, but Comp being on, Comp winning games or losing games has really been the decider as to whether or not Koi is a legit team or not. As good as Larson and Malrang and Shigenda have been over the course of this year, Comp winning is a win for Koi, and Comp losing is a loss for Koi. It really is as simple as that. Malrang was out jungled for a lot of this. The pressure coming in, not only from the enemy jungle, but from the enemy lanes were significant. Larson really, the any pick is just not his style. I don't think it requires him to leave lane. I think a little bit too much for his playstyle, and we've kind of seen that over the course of the year. It's not really working for Koi in particular, and like I said earlier, Shigenda's going to get a lot of shit for this game. He's going to be kind of blamed, I would say, for Adam getting really fed. I don't necessarily think it was his fault, though. I think he did just about everything he could have done in a situation like this, and unfortunately, it just wasn't enough to be able to stop Adam, and there were some good engages coming out from the Cassante, but again, BDS just had too much gold, and Adam knows that Olaf champion significantly too well to be able to outplay it, and so for Koi, I still think that there are a lot of good things coming out from this team. I still think that there are a lot of positives to take away from them, but maybe not the most complete game of all time, and really it does feel like this team's success and their positives and negatives are pretty much all dependent on which version of Comp shows up on any given day. And then for BDS on the other side, really nice bounce back here from that G2 game. They weren't really all that competitive on day #1, so to see them just kind of control the map, have fantastic vision coverage, have fantastic objective control, and kind of look a lot more like that spring split BDS, I think is a really, really good thing to see. I'm not sold on this being like a top 1 or top 2 team, but, you know, at number 3, I think I had them relatively pinned down at the start of the split. And then moving on to our final game of day #2, the middle of the week here, we had another one that I was excited to see. All these early games definitely give us a good idea. We had Team Heretics taking on Astralis, And Heretics pick up their second win of the split, undefeated through the first 2 games, and they're looking damn good. I know a lot of people were talking about the changes that this team made in the offseason here, and you know what? I'm on board. I'm very, very, very much on board. I was really high on Flakked in the ERLs. I already talked about that a lot in this video. We're going to talk about him a bit here in this game as well, but VTO, I was very confident was going to just be a better version of himself. It feels like Excel just is a disaster and gets the worst out of every single player that goes into that organization. And we have to remember, last year we were talking about VTO as somebody who was in the conversation for being the #1 mid laner in the LEC. This dude is a former MVP. It's not just a guy, right? Like, his talent level is top of the league kind of level. And while he's not necessarily that right now for Heretics, who's to say he can't get that kind of form back if he has his confidence, if he has, you know, the rest of the team playing around him? He's got some fantastic facilitating players in Yankos, in Mursa, who I said he had great chemistry with, and he was really good on the Ahri in this game, was much better than Leader, who was a player that really broke out last split. So just good stuff coming in from VTO. We know that he can play pretty much any style for this team. I think a lot of that, especially early on in the split, is going to be more supportive coming out of that mid lane spot, because I think this team really does want to play for bot lane. They want to get Flakked back and comfortable in the LEC, and obviously, that's a great strategy. We'll talk about him in just a second because he's been great. But VTO stepping up and really being a great mid laner for this team through their first 2 games is a fantastic development. And I think if that continues, if he can legitimately be a top 3 or top 4 mid laner in the region, then this team is going to skyrocket up in the standings. And so far, it's been a pretty damn good look for him. But player of the game is going to go to Flakked in the bot lane. He's legit. All of the form that we saw from him in the ERLs is absolutely legit. It's honestly insane that he was kicked out of the LEC if this was his upside. I understand that he was a mostly weak side player for G2 last year, but he went to Worlds and then immediately lost his spot, and even I was like, yeah, it kind of makes some sense, but where, like, if he was playing like this the whole time, like, this is crazy high upside in terms of what he can offer, like, just the aggressiveness and the confidence that he plays with is very rare. And there's a lot of AD carries in the LEC that I would consider very good AD carries. This is a very deep AD carry room, which is the exact opposite of what I was saying about the region at the start of the split, but it's turned into like every team having a good AD carry. But Flakked is right up there with almost all of them if he can perform like this consistently, picking up the Draven, but even things like the Aphelios, even things like the Zeri, we know he can play more late game team fights. We know he can play more early game aggression, you know, as we saw in this game. And so Flakked just looking really good with and without resources. Mursa has been great to start the split, this time on the Nautilus. His emergence, I don't think, is particularly surprising to me, somebody who's been a fan of Mursa basically ever since he joined the LEC, but I know a lot of people were really down on him after the first 2 splits here on Heretics. I still really like him as a player, and again, I think if him and Flakked can get a really good chemistry going in that bot lane, like they kind of already have, at least to start this split, that could be a very dangerous duo to end up going into. Mursa's also a great macro player. He's going to be moving around the map. He's going to be trying to create plays. He worked with VTO incredibly well on Misfits, so good to see that. Yankos, 1-1 in 16 on the Maokai. That's basically the exact role that you want him to fill on this team, and Evie looks so much more comfortable in the top side than he did, especially in the spring split. And so Heretics, just kind of everything rolling for them right now, and you've got to be excited for the upside of this team. And then for Astralis on the other side, it's not a great look. I know we were kind of waiting for this team to kind of fall off, but it felt like they really established and solidified themselves quite a bit in the spring split. But honestly, maybe with the rest of the league leveling up, some of the things that they did well are getting exploited a little bit more. We're seeing permabans on things like the Aurelia coming out for Leader, and he's had to go to more mage picks this time than Nico, and honestly, he didn't look particularly adept at the Nico. Not that he was bad, he certainly wasn't the worst part of this team. In fact, I would argue that he was probably the best part of this team. But still, he's not that game takeover kind of threat that I think he was for a significant portion of last split. There were good and bad moments coming out from Leader, and I think that's really going to kind of limit the upside of Astralis because they won through him a lot. Now, Kabe and Jonghoon have really been the force for Astralis over the course of this year, but they've kind of been outclassed in lane in both of their first 2 games. Again, it's against 2 really good teams and 2 really good bot lanes in particular, and so I don't want to overreact or anything like that, but maybe with a lot of these other, you know, lower teams kind of upgrading their bot lanes, like Fnatic, like Team Heretics, Kabe and Jonghoon might see themselves start to fall down the standings at least a little bit more. Still really like them as a duo, and they're definitely the most consistent piece on this team, but Astralis just feels like they're getting a little bit outclassed in terms of, they're getting power scaled. I hate to say that they're getting, they're getting a power creeped. That's the word I'm looking for. They're getting power creeped right now by the rest of the league, by the new releases coming out in the game, and it's a little bit unfortunate to see 113. I was already skeptical quite a bit about him going into the split. He's just been fine for this team, but my dud of the game is going to go to Finn on the top side. Some hit and misses game, some hit and miss games coming out from Finn. I think just in general, he's a player that's going to look good when the team is looking good and look bad when the team is looking bad, and that's always kind of been the case for him, whether it's been here or in North America. I think it's kind of just been his MO as a player. He's not necessarily going to change the fate of the team, although he can have a couple of games here or there on things like the Gangplank that can be a little bit more explosive, but put him on Sion, put him on weak side, and if the team is inting, he's going to look pretty bad on some of those engages. It's just kind of how it is with him, and so overall, Astralis is starting to concern me. I'm not going to freak out and overreact and panic and say this team is like definitely bottom 2 or anything like that, but there is reason to be worried when it comes to Astralis, especially early on. And then for Heretics on the other side, upgrades, upgrades, upgrades. They're looking great with their new players, and I really do think that this team has like top 3, top 2 potential upside if everything continues to click. If Flacket can be a top, 2 or 3 AD carry in the league, if VTO can be a top 3 or 4 mid laner in the league, that's a ridiculously scary combo, and we could be looking at a team that went from, bottom 2, not even making the group stage, to a team that pretty easily makes the top 4 in the playoff stage. And that's going to bring us into day number 3 now, our final day of week 1 here in the LEC, and we kicked it off with a banger. 2 of the more shaky teams in week number 1 so far. We had Excel taking on SK Gaming, and SK does pick up their first win of the split, dropping Excel to 0-3 and securing their spot in last place, at least to end week number 1, a place that they have been well acquainted with over the course of this year so far. But good for SK to be able to pick up a win. I gotta be honest, though, when talking about this game, I'm probably gonna mention this quite a bit. This was a fiesta. This was clearly 2 teams that don't know how to play the late game, and honestly, that made it pretty fun to watch. It was certainly an entertaining game, but if you're looking for high-quality League of Legends, you're not really going to get it out of these 2 teams in particular. Still a lot of question marks coming out from both of them, but I am proud of SK for being able to come in and win the game. There were a couple of players that I think were stepping up and certainly trying to make this a lot easier for them, but still a lot of miscommunications and a lot of missed opportunities, I think, coming in from both of these teams. But my player of the game is going to go to Exakick in the bot lane. Continues to be the driving force for SK. I know I talk about him a lot, and people might actually be getting a little bit annoyed with it, how much I'm like, oh, Exakick is so good, and he would do so much better on a different team. I really don't think that he's, regressed all that much as a player, but I really agree with all of those statements and all of those sentiments. I think Exakick is still one of the premier AD carries in the LEC, just like he was earlier in this year. I just don't think that the team around him is necessarily performing up to expectations. Not to say that he's been perfect. He certainly will have moments where he makes some mistakes, but his aggressive nature, I think, is giving SK pretty much all of the advantages that they're able to generate over the course of these games, and I thought he was fantastic towards the back half here. Consistent damage is just something that a lot of teams, especially bad teams, really struggle with in team fights. We see that out of Excel. They really don't have consistent damage. They'll do a couple of things right and a couple of things wrong, and then they won't really have any way to win team fights from that, but Exakick is pretty consistent in terms of being able to show up and do his job towards the back half of games. Maybe sometimes he's a little bit overextended, but I think for the most part, it's still a positive overall for him and for his team, and so he's going to get my player of the game, and he was certainly SK's best player in week number 1. I actually think he was pretty decent in all 3 games, but especially games 1 and 3, I think he was actually really, really solid, and so a lot of positives to take away there. I think the rest of this team also played fine. Doss had some good moments on the Milio. That champion is actually ludicrous, and it gives Jinx so many options in these, both in the early game skirmishes and in the late game, that really make this champion very difficult to deal with. I'm surprised we're not seeing this duo in the bot lane more. Certus was pretty good on the Lissandra, setting up plays, but was also caught out. That range can be a little bit tricky to play with at the pro level, because if you are a little bit too far forward, then you can sometimes be in a bad spot. Luckily, Lissandra has a little bit of a get-out-of-jail-free card, and so not really too worried about Certus. He played fine. Marcoon had some good engages, but also probably could have stood to be a little bit more aggressive. Same thing with Certus, I would say, overall. And then Irrelevant was just kind of fine in the top lane. This really was Exakick dominating team fights, and Excel both making good plays and then also horrendously bad plays. I mean, there were a couple of players in this game that just felt completely mentally checked out or just mechanically inferior, and that's going to be kind of culminating in the top lane for me. My dud of the game is going to go to Otawamne in this one. I know people are still pretty in on him as a player, and I, for one, am as well. well. I think in a different circumstance, he could actually be pretty decent, but man, it just feels like he is not there anymore. Like, it just feels like whatever sort of motivation that he had going into this year is just gone now that this team is 0-3. They've been 10th place in both splits up until this point. There's just not a lot of hope and confidence coming in from this team, and I think that Odoamne feels incredibly checked out. This was a bad K'Sante game. Like, this wasn't just an okay, here, could have had more, could have been a little bit better kind of K'Sante game. No, this was a bad K'Sante game, and I think that that's definitely got to be at least a little bit frustrating for Excel fans because, at least you want to see this team try. Like, they're not going to be particularly good, but you don't want them to completely give up. And if Odo is just going to not play well on a champion that's pretty crazy broken right now, that's going to be pretty frustrating. Abadage, I would say, actually had a pretty good game and certainly had some really good moments in team fights, but you got to talk about that Baron play where everybody's fighting, everybody's back and forth. It's looking pretty good. Abadage is playing perfectly on the edge of range, and then he flashes in. All he's got to do is land the ultimate, and this looks like a free win for Excel with Abadage playing out of his mind. And he just whiffs. He just whiffs the R. He just misses everybody. And it's like, how is that the part that you mess up? Like, are you losing on purpose? Have you been instructed to completely throw the games? Because that's really what it feels like at times for this team. So credit to Abadage. He somehow managed to screw that up in a situation where it felt impossible. Patrick is just not aggressive enough to be able to change the fortune of this team, even if I do think he's very good mechanically in late game team fights. He's not the guy that's going to step up and dominate a lot of these fights. He's going to need Peel, and he's going to need the rest of his team to be able to engage. He's not Exakick on the other side of the map, who's going to try to create his own offense. He's just going to capitalize on what the team gives him at a pretty decent level, but the team isn't giving him anything right now, so he looks bad, and honestly, that's on Patrick as well. He needs to become more aggressive. Limit is whatever. Had a decent game on the Yuumi, but again, not a good one. And then Peach is fine. He really is not meshed well with this team, especially in the early game. There's really no plays coming out from them at all, but Excel just feels completely lost. They don't know how to play the mid or the late game. Their team fighting has been incredibly lackluster, and it just feels like this team has lost all sense of motivation and confidence up until this point. And so, yeah, they're the number 10 team in the league, and clearly I think they proved that this week. And then for SK, congratulations on at least being able to take down Excel. Certainly not sold about this team. There are a lot of players and a lot of plays on this team that I'm still very questioning of, and I really don't know if I like SK moving forward, but at the very least, they're not going to be walking out of week 1 winless. And then moving on to our second game of day number 3 here, and it's a little bit of an upset with the team picking up their first win of the split. We had Team BDS taking on Astralis, and Astralis picks up the win here. Really nice to see them at least get one win coming out of week number 1. Would have been pretty disastrous to see them at 0-3. I know obviously their schedule was certainly not the easiest on the docket, but, I wanted to see at least something coming out of this team, and they played a style that I think fits them a lot better in this game. I think they said, whatever, if Aurelia's going to get banned, that's fine. We don't need to conform to the meta. We can continue to play things that we think are good, and that to them is Yasuo in the mid lane, and really, that unlocked leader. He was so much more aggressive in this game. I think it allowed the bot lane to play a little bit more aggro, Jonghoon in particular, which we'll get to, but BDS certainly showing the coin flip nature of the style that they can sometimes play. This game was over at level 1, and there really wasn't a lot that BDS was going to be able to do after that. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Jonghoon, even though he wasn't involved really in that level 1 play. He's just so active on the map. He's so scary to have to play into on the enemy team when he's on playmakers like this Blitzcrank. Obviously very well known for his Pyke, but Blitz kind of follows a similar suit. A little bit more of a, feast or famine pick. I think the Pyke in general is going to be a little bit more aggressive in terms of how he plays, but the Blitz, a little bit more of that like standardized hook champion, if you will, and Jonghoon still plays that at a ridiculously high level. He's going to get my player of the game. He's just awesome. He continues to look like one of the top 1, 2, 3 supports in the LEC, and he has ever since he joined the region. He really at no point has ever been anything lower than that in my mind. He is one of the most consistent, one of the highest profile supports in the entire region. I think I had him at number 3 coming into the split. People will let me know, obviously, if I'm wrong about that, but it's somewhere in that range where he was really, really good, just maybe not on the level of like Mickey and Hylissang, at least of what they performed so far, but you put Jonghoon on G2, you put Jonghoon on Mad Lions, maybe he is number 1 in the entire region. Maybe he's number 1 in the entire West. He really is that damn good in terms of what he's able to offer at the support position. Again, he can have some up and down games, but I think Kabe is great, and I think his style meshes really well with the rest of this team, but I think Kabe would look a lot worse if he had a support that wasn't as active as someone like Jonghoon is for what this team ends up wanting to do. But Kabe was still good in this game, certainly not the standout. They like picking him things like the Xayah that can be a little bit more self-sufficient. It's why we don't see this team really ever go to things like the Aphelios. It's because of the fact that Xayah in general just offers a little bit more, I would say, escapability, and you can leave Kabe on an island a little bit more. He kind of likes that as a player. He wants to farm up and get to the late game. He's happy to just be a big team fighter for this team, or to shine in the late game, or the mid game, I should say, if he needs to, but he's not really a big resource guy in the early game, which is why Jonghoon, being such a pressure cooker in game, is so positive. He can create in the 2v2, but oftentimes you see him moving around the map and trying to create for jungle and mid, which I think really helps this team out. Leader was obviously great on the Yasuo. A couple of mistakes here and there, and obviously BDS wanted to try and invest in shutting down this Yasuo in some team fights, but he was so far ahead by the mid game that it didn't really matter. Finn, 1-1-3. Topside was also pretty damn good. Astralis just looked so much better, so much more complete, I would say, in this game. And I think that's really where you have to be excited for this team. When they played in their first couple of games, you're like, well, it feels like they're one-dimensional and maybe a little bit not good when they have to be playing a style that isn't the one exact thing that they do really well. And this game doesn't exactly disprove that narrative, because they did get the thing that they do well and they did play it well, but at the very least, they showed that they still have that in them. Now, it's going to be interesting to see if teams adapt and try to take away the Yasuo now, maybe Aurelia, Yasuo, like those bans being consistent against Astralis, or maybe if Astralis feels like they need to go back to playing more meta, especially against other teams. But whatever ends up happening from here, at the very least, they have shown that if they get comps that they are comfortable on, if they get comps that they feel good about playing, that they are going to be able to execute on them. And then for BDS on the other side, they're just a very coin flippy team. They risk it all in some very aggressive plays. That's kind of Adam's play style in general, but the rest of this team has definitely adapted itself to that. I think Crownie and Labrov were generally fine, but the top side of this map just did not survive, especially the solo laners, who were both bad. It was very difficult trying to decide who dud of the game was between Adam and Nuke. I think both of them played very poorly in this game, and I'm going to give it to Nuke on the side of BDS just because I think his champion's a little bit stronger, and he probably should have had more of an impact in this game, but man, he was just set so far behind so quickly that Yasuo was outpacing him at basically every avenue, and really, Nuke has not been all that good to start this split, if I'm being honest. I'm not saying that he's been this massive issue, but Nuke has always been the player that I was most worried about on BDS at being able to hold up. I think Sheo has shown a lot of good things. Adam's very coin flippy, but his highs are higher than anybody else in the league. And Crownie and Labrovich have just generally been very good, but Nuke, I think, has benefited a lot from BDS's success, and I think when this team isn't as good in the early game, he can struggle, especially in the 1v1 and laning phase, which I definitely think we saw. Obviously, a little bit of an exception game here, but just something that I've noticed. And then Adam was also really bad, again, basically through the game at level 1 for that Renekton. When that Renekton's that far behind in the early game, like, he's going to be completely doomed as a champion. There's just no coming back from that into something like a Rumble, who's just infinitely going to be better in the mid to late game than you are. So really unfortunate circumstance, I would say, coming in from BDS, but this is, again, the kind of play style that they end up liking to play with. They want to play this more aggressive style. They want to try to flip the game. BDS is going to lose some because of it, but I'm not going to freak out. Again, best of ones, losing the game at level 1, it happens every once in a while. Walking out of week 1, 1, and 2 was certainly probably not on your bingo card, but one of those losses being to G2 is probably pretty acceptable, and the way that this team ended up bouncing back on day 2 gives me confidence that they're still a good team, especially if Crownie and Labrov can get to that mid to late game at a relatively even state. And so I still like this BDS team, but man, this was not a particularly fun game to watch if you're a fan of them. And then Astralis on the other side, they're fine. They are really good at the thing that they do well. I'm just worried about what happens when you start taking this team off of that. Maybe their champion pool is big enough, and maybe teams feel like they have to ban the Lucian. Maybe they feel like they have to ban the Maokai, things like that over the Yasuo. But if this team, if Leader in particular starts to get target banned, you're really putting a lot of pressure on Kabe and Jonghoon to basically win every single game. And with how a lot of the other bot lanes in this region have leveled up in terms of their consistency, I'm just a little bit concerned about what they're going to be able to do with that. But this was a nice win. It shows that this team still has a lot of good in them. I want to see it for more than just one game. And then moving on to our third game of day number 3 here, and it's another intriguing matchup. Two teams that I think for a long time were kind of clumped together. Maybe not this year, but in previous years. We had Koi taking on Mad Lions, and Mad makes it a 3-0 undefeated week coming out of week number 1. Now that is impressive. I saw a lot of people that were really doubting this team going into the split, and I'm not going to say that all of those doubts should be completely wiped away, but in week number 1, they beat Vitality, G2, and Koi. That's a pretty damn good week number 1 for this team, and it really was the entire team that looked good, and mostly the roles, honestly, that I was most concerned about going into the split. We knew that Elyoya and Niski were probably going to be fine. They have been fine as a duo basically the entire time that they have played together, especially when Niski is being a little bit more of a roam style and Elyoya can take a lot of the resources. I think that those two really know how to play that at a super high level, and I don't really have a lot of question marks about them being able to do that in the finals or against the best teams in the LEC. Like, they're the players I'm not as worried about. It was top lane taking that next step up and showing that the best of 5 form can be repeatable, and it was bot lane just being significantly more consistent, and that was week number 1 for this team. Honestly, Elyoya and Niski were the 2 least important members of this team in week number 1, and that's damn good. My player of the game is going to go to Carzzy in the bot lane. He had a phenomenal first week of the season. He's just like a sensational Aphelios player, and he really hasn't been this over the course of his entire career. He's had good moments, but man, his gun control, like, that's a weird thing to say, but like, his gun rotation and his ability to make sure that he always has the right guns in every opportunity is like next level. It is legit best in the world in this game, and that is actually absurd. Like, this was not a Carzzy performance. If you took nameplates off, I would have thought this was like Gala, right? Like, the way that he was playing Aphelios was actually insane. The way that he was always in the right spot and that he always had the right guns. Only the best AD carries in the world do this consistently. Now, Carzzy hasn't been able to do it entirely consistently over the course of his career, but the fact that he can put out a performance like this, like, that's crazy high upside. He was insane in week number 1, legitimately one of the best AD carries in the entire region, and if he can keep that up, that's going to be massive for this team. And then Hylissang was also, of course, really good on the recon. Those engages, that ability to, I guess, really set up the rest of the team to make a lot of this easier. He just does it so effortlessly, especially in lane. Playing Aphelios recon into Xayah Leona is not a particularly easy laning phase for Mad Lions, but still, they came out of that laning phase much stronger, and it really was just because of player diff. So, big credit to both of them, and then Chasey on the top side continues to be good. I would say Elyoya was probably their 3rd most important player in this game, but Chasey, Carzzy, Hylissang, definitely the players that I think you need to highlight the most coming out of this first week. And then for Koi on the other side, 1 and 2, it could be worse. Obviously, losing to Mad definitely could be worse. They're arguably the best team in the LEC at the moment, and I really do think that they're incredibly hot, and there's a lot of good things to take away from them. So losing to them isn't bad, but there are question marks about this team that I think definitely need to be answered. Before I jump into, like, the really big negatives, I gotta talk about Larssen, because I don't really get this, right? He built on-hit Ahri, like, he built Static Shiv, he built Lichbane, he clearly wanted to auto-attack, but then in team fights, I don't think he right-clicked once. Like, did he auto once in any of these team fights? It's almost like he built this build because someone told him it was strong, but, like, didn't realize that he had to play differently. He was playing it like regular Ahri. He was using ultimate to dash into the wall and then not auto-attacking everybody, and then he has no damage because he's built, you know, Lichbane and Static Shiv, and you have to be able to auto-attack to really do anything with those items, and so just weird stuff in general coming out from Larssen. As fed as he was, like, this could have been a very close game, and Koi absolutely could have taken it had he just played normally, but he didn't, and that was a big problem for them. And I think Shigenda was actually pretty good in this game as well. You could argue he was the better top laner out of these two. He was definitely carrying a lot of these team fights and keeping the game close, but bot lane was just too big of a gap, honestly, in this game. Both Comp and Advn played pretty poorly, and Advn's gonna get my dud of the game because I think the Leona was a little bit more noticeable. That pick is just not strong. Leona is one of the weaker engagers right now in the meta, you know, as opposed to Rakan, as opposed to Nautilus, you know, even Blitzcrank. Some of these other picks that I think we've seen significantly more success with. Leona's just not that, and I understand that Advn's a more engaged style player, but if Leona is what you're going to default to in situations like that, that's not a good thing, and Comp honestly didn't look great in this game either. So ups and downs, I would say, for the Koi bot lane in week number 1. They looked great in their first game, and then they looked pretty bad in the games after that. Gonna be interesting to see if it was an opponent thing or if it's going to be just kind of an inconsistent balance for them, but like I said before, Koi really needs their bot lane to be able to win because other players on this map are simply not going to carry the games. It's just not going to happen. Shigenda's going to play well because he's a good top laner. Larssen's relatively consistent at getting to the late game. I just wish he hadn't built this build. I wish he would have went regular Ahri, and then he probably would have been a lot more useful. Malrang is fine, but Comp and Advn, and Comp in particular, are really what are going to push Koi over the top, and if he's not showing up, like, that's a major issue for this team. And then for Mad, 3-0 is pretty fantastic, and everybody playing well, I think, is great. Niski has definitely shown some questionable things, but I trust him to be able to bounce back. He's been able to do it quite a bit over the past year or so. So Mad Lions Lions, honestly, arguably looking like the best team in the LEC, and that is something that I think we all kind of wanted to see coming out of week number 1. And then moving on to our 4th game of day number 3 here, and it is the classic matchup here in the LEC, and one that I think after the first couple of days, a lot of people were excited for. We had Fnatic taking on G2 Esports, and G2 does pick up the win here. Fnatic's undefeated run comes to an end on day number 3, but still, week number 1 is a positive overall for them. I think a lot of the takeaways that we ended up having for Fnatic ended up sticking in this game, but G2 really needed that bounce back. They needed to give us all some confidence after that loss to Mad Lions to show that, hey, we were kind of fooling around a bit. There were a couple of moments where we could have taken it a lot more seriously, and we probably would have done a lot better in that game had we done that. But luckily for them, they were able to show that off in this game. So good stuff from them all around, in my opinion. You could really pinpoint almost everybody on the team as having a good game. Caps had some really fantastic RE charms, and that really set people up. Yike was basically everywhere he needed to be on the map. Great macro. Broken Blade dominated on a ridiculously strong Cassante pick, but pretty obviously my player of the game is going to go to Hansama in the bot lane. It is very rare for Hansama to have a bad game, especially when G2 is doing well, and this was definitely it. I think you can still give a lot of credit to the 0-1 and 24 Milio in his support position in Mickey X, who I think also had a pretty fantastic game, especially early on in the laning phase. He was the one who really controlled a lot of that, but you want to talk about late game team fights, you want to talk about scaling into the mid game, you want to talk about damage, that was Hansama, and he really delivered in this one. I think G2 as a team really kind of won as a unit rather than individual players, but it's really good to point out how well Hans plays with the rest of his team when he is able to generate that early lead. As good as Noah and Trimby have been, they're very new together, and I could see some early, a dysfunction coming in maybe against some of the better bot lanes in the league. Fnatic, to their credit, have been very good, but they've had a very weak schedule, I would say, to start this split, and so this was their first real big test, especially in the bot lane, and I think Hans and Mickey definitely showed that at least in the early game, they've still got quite a bit of ways to go, but Hans is just an incredible player. Mickey is also pretty fantastic, and I think Mickey is honestly going to go underrated for his impact on this game as a whole. His early game is just actually terrific, especially compared to basically any other support in the West. There really is no one who plays the early game as consistently as Mickey, but he's also arguably the best team fighter at that position, and so it's very difficult to find a weakness in his game. He has basically re-emerged as the best support in the West by a considerable margin over the course of this year so far, and I don't even really think it's all that up for debate. He has been so crazy consistent, and him and Hans as a duo, I think definitely propelled this team forward quite a bit, but like I was saying, Broken Blade also had a really good game, and he had a really good week overall. Both of their wins this week, G2 can at least partially attribute to Broken Blade, which I think is a really good thing. I know people are continuously calling for his head. I talked about it a ton early on in the video already, but it's just kind of funny how things end up working out. I think Broken Blade has been one of the more consistent members of this team over the course of this year so far, and I think that is very likely to continue, if I'm being entirely honest. He's just been solid. Caps and Yike were solid as well. It's much better to get claps than it is to get craps, and I thought he played a good game here. Yike was honestly the least relevant member of G2, I would say, for their success individually in this game, but it's not like he played bad. I mean, his objective control was really good. He was where he needed to be. I just think that there was a lot of shine and spotlight placed onto this bot lane and this top lane in particular, and that unfortunately is going to drag at least a little bit of it away from the mid-jungle duo, but G2 looking a lot better in this bounce back than they did against Mad Lions. And then for Fnatic, like I said, unfortunately the undefeated run comes to an end here, but you're not going to be too disappointed. I still think this team played fine. Like, they kind of got destroyed, I'm going to be honest, but it's against G2, and a G2 team that I think did have something to prove. They always step up, Caps in particular, against his former organization, and I think that there was definitely something in the air here that they really wanted to beat Fnatic with, but a couple of players disappointing, and really the main ones are going to be the solo laners for me. I really went back and forth on who to give dud of the series to, but I ended up giving it to Humanoid in the mid lane. He was not very good on the Nico. That's a pick I think a lot of people are considering super bannable right now, must ban, if you will, and Humanoid definitely didn't show that off. I think, like I said, Fnatic not exactly facing the toughest competition to start this split. Not to say that either Astralis or Excel are awful. Well, Excel is pretty awful, but Astralis can play the game, but, Humanoid hasn't really been tested, I think, in that same way that, he had been tested over the course of this year, so it's going to be interesting to see if the first couple of games are more going to be the norm, or if when he faces better competition, he might fall back into what he's kind of been over the course of this year, which is just crazy inconsistent, but this was a pretty bad Nico game. It was pretty awful watching him die to that turret in the bush at the end of the game. I would have felt completely tilted after that, but not a great game from him overall. And then Oscar Renan was the other one who I just didn't think had a particularly really good game. Broken Blade was so much better than him, but the problem with Oscar was he was just afraid to make plays, it seemed like. And that's something that I was worried about with this Fnatic team, not necessarily because of player composition, but because of what this team has shown over the course of the last few splits, in particular this last year, is that when they get behind, they kind of just cave. They don't really play all that well, trying to gain a lead back. And yes, their early games were really good in the first 2 days, but I'm still concerned about what happens when this team does fall behind. Razork and Humanoid in particular are really bad from behind, or at least they have been recently. Oscar felt incredibly scared to go for any Malphite engages this game, even in opportunities where it felt like that would be a no-brainer in team fights. And as talented as Noah is, like, he can't solo carry this team with just his mechanics. He's going to need some resources, and so Fnatic definitely has some things in here that concern me, but it's their first loss of the split. Again, best of ones. It's against G2. I'm not going to overreact, but I'm also not going to overreact and make, like, say this team is definite top 2, top 3 after this first week. And then for G2 on the other side, this team is still really good. I know the loss to Mab is going to frustrate some fans, but they still looked kind of good in that game, and like I said, I think if Caps took the late game a little bit more seriously as that Nico, they probably could have won that one. Being able to bounce back and beat Fnatic here, I think, is really solid. They beat BDS earlier in the week as well, so a solid week beating good competition coming out from G2. They're still one of the best teams in the league, but they're always G2. They're going to fumble the bag sometimes. And that's going to bring us to our final game of the week here in week number 1 of the LEC, and it was a pretty damn good one between Team Vitality and Team Heretics. And Heretics complete the 3-0 week number 1. Damn good stuff coming in from this team. You gotta be impressed with what they've been able to do with, I think, a lot of players that have been looked over and passed by other organizations. Really, really good stuff. Players like VTO, players like Flakked were not being clamored by a lot of these other teams to be added, especially, you know, in the middle of the split. Even someone like Mersa, I think a lot of people really underestimated, but this team's 3-0 to start the year, and they're looking pretty damn good doing it. The mid ADC combo has just been such a major upgrade for Heretics already. I'm going to talk about Flakked. I really am. I promise. He has been unreal in this first week. I mean, almost as perfect as you could have possibly asked for in his first 3 games. But VTO pulling out the Kai'Sa mid as the counter to LeBlanc. We've been talking about how this pick is basically unbeatable at the current moment because of the way Static Shiv is just currently in the game. LeBlanc procs it basically instantly, and there really aren't a lot of things that can beat her relatively efficiently, but Kai'Sa seems to definitely be one of them. VTO obviously, you know, was interviewed after this and was asked, you know, how did this go in scrims? You know, were you practicing this? He's like, I have never played this before. And so pretty unreal for him to have the confidence to pull that out when this team is undefeated against a good Vitality team. Against Perks, a legendary mid laner here in the LEC, but he did it and he looked pretty damn good on it. But my player of the game is going to go to Flakked again in the bot lane. That's 3 games for Heretics, 3 player of the games for Flakked. He has been unstoppable. The dude has been the best player in the week, and spoiler alert, you know, player of the week's not going to be a particularly difficult decision for me. He's just been unreal. Absolutely flawless. Like, his positioning is great. His aggressiveness is eye-opening. This is really not something we saw from him on G2. He was definitely more weak side, and obviously, part of that is going to be how that team ended up wanting to play. They want to dump resources into players like Broken Blade and Caps, who I thought really were their strength last year, but did Flakked really have this in him the whole time? I mean, this is unreal mechanics coming out from him. He's just outclassing Upset, which is not something that a lot of LEC AD carries are able to do. People are going to complain about Zeri, and they're going to complain about Milio, and yes, those champions are strong, but how many times did we see Zeri lose in the LEC this week? How many times have we seen Zeri lose, especially in the LCK and the LPL this year? This champion is not unbeatable. You still have to be the better AD carry to make it look broken, and Flakked was the better AD carry in this game, and so that's my spiel. You gotta give him a lot of credit. I know people are just going to write it off as the Zeri being incredibly strong, but Flakked deserves all of the praise that he's going to get this week, and if he's going to be able to keep this up, like, Heretics is going to be a top 4 team. This is legit, very legit from them. And then Mersa, obviously, I think has meshed with this team very well. Talked about him and VTO a lot, but him and Flakked, I think, have formed a very scary 2v2 in the bot lane. Flakked was always a relatively good early game AD carry. He was somebody who, I think, showed that aggressive tendency in lane. It just wasn't there in team fights. He wasn't playing on the edge of danger in the same way that he is now, but Mersa, I think, has enabled that a lot. Neither of these players necessarily known for dominating, but they really have so far this split. Could just be a really good combination. Could also be a, you know, a potential, I don't want to say fraud alert, but could be a really good week. I don't want to overreact and say that they're the best bot lane of all time or anything like that, but man, they certainly looked like the best bot lane in the LEC in week number 1, so that's good. Evie and Jankos were fine this week. It's pretty insane how every single Heretics game last split, we were talking about how Jankos is giga trapped and was never going to be able to win with this team, and now it's like, I didn't forget he was on the team, because he obviously had a lot of good plays, but just like, he's not the part that we need to talk about when it comes to Heretics, and I think he's going to be very excited about that. Still a really good player. Evie is solid enough on the top side, even if he did kind of get blasted in this game. So Heretics looking very good, and they're going to be so pleased with that 3-0 week. And then for Vitality on the other side, this team's not looking particularly great. I think a loss to Heretics is definitely concerning here, especially for a team that would take nothing less than top 4, I think. But again, I do want to say we've still got a lot of split left. Yes, 1/3 of it is technically done in the regular season, but as long as this team makes top 8, if they're able to rebound and get better in best of 3s, that's going to be big for them. I still think that there are a lot of question marks. Perks is going to get my dud of the game here. LeBlanc did get counterpicked, and honestly, Perks didn't really have any sort of impact on this game. When you're picking this comp in particular, obviously, Photon was incredibly strong on the top side, but you need Upset to step up, and you need Perks to be this big side lane threat in order to facilitate a lot of these engages that you want to go for with Wukong and with Nautilus and even with Gwen to an extent. And the LeBlanc was just not relevant. There really was nothing that she was going to be able to do in this game. I think you could realistically also give this dud of the game to Bo in the jungle, who just had no pressure, but it really wasn't his fault, in my opinion, that this team was kind of collapsing in the way that it was. I think jungle mid just didn't really have any sort of prio because, in my opinion, draft went pretty poorly for them, and they really lost early. Team Heretics had the kind of pressure and the player skill to be able to execute on what was a good draft. And so, credit to them for that. But Photon was actually really good for this team in this game. Had a rough game number 1, but really bounced back in their win in game number 2. And then was again very good in game number 3. Definitely the better top laner, but top lane doesn't really matter unless you're able to fully commit and bring them into team fights. But when you're going up against a Fed Kai'Sa Zeri, like that's going to be very difficult to team fight into, even as a Gwen. And so Vitality definitely has some issues right now, some things that I think they're going to want to work out. But there is talent on this team, and we've seen them go up and down before, but people seem to forget they were a top 4 team last split. They weren't just, crashing out of the playoffs or anything like that. A top 3 team, if we're, being a precise here. They got 3rd place last split, and so they're not a team that has just been completely disastrous in every major moment, but there definitely are reasons to be concerned with the form that they're currently in. And then Heretics looks phenomenal, better than basically anybody could have ever anticipated this team gelling, and right now they genuinely look like a top 4 team. All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC Week 1 overview and analysis of all 3 days. Up on the screen now, you're going to see the updated standings in the LEC. Any ties will just be broken alphabetically. Of course, it's only after 3 games, and so there are a lot of ties, but in the first column to the right, you're going to see my updated power rankings. In the second column, you're going to see how those have changed from preseason to now, so we can go over the risers and the fallers after this first week of games. Quite a bit of change here. We're going to go in power ranking order just because I think it's going to make it a lot easier. Mad Lions jumps G2 up to number 1 because they beat them. It really is that simple. I think that there is still a really strong argument to be made that G2 is the better team. They had a lot of control of that game and just made some foolish mistakes towards the back half, but Mad won the game and they beat them in this, the playoffs last split. There's reason to believe that Mad realistically can be listed at number 1 here, and so for now, they're going to be listed at number 1. If they struggle, G2's right on their heels at number 2. They're still, in my opinion, the clear-cut top 2 teams in the league in terms of consistency and what I would expect out of them, and so I'm not really feeling a big shift here, even if I am moving them. I just think that Mad deserves credit for being able to take that game. Where the shifts start to happen, well, unfortunately not at 3, where BDS is going to stay. Some people are going to want to see them drop after a 1-2 week, but I think this team is the exact same. They're going to be a little bit streaky because of the way that they play, but I'm still very scared of them. I would much rather face almost any other team in a best of 3 or a best of 5 than BDS at this point, which is why they still last at number 3. But the big change is at number 4, and that's Heretics jumping up all the way from number 8. Going from number 8 to number 4, they feel legit. They feel like a top 4 team right now. If VTO and Flacket are going to play like this, or even kind of like this the entire split, that's going to be massive. Mercer's been playing well. Yankos is still on this team, and Evie's solid enough, even if I do think he still is a weaker top laner in the grand scheme of things. This team just feels very legit right now, and they're by far going to be the biggest risers this week. Vitality falling down to number 5. Because of it, they drop out of the top 4 in my power rankings. They could fall even lower if they continue to struggle as much as they are. Some people are very much going to want to see them already lower. And I'm probably already going to get a lot of sad comments that Fnatic is only at number 6. Really good week for Fnatic, but remember, their wins are over Astralis and Excel, who you can see where I have them in my power rankings. I just don't know how quality those wins are, and this team still has some major issues at playing from behind, which I think will make them struggle against some of the more lane-dominant teams. Now, if they come out in week number 2 and play really well against some of these other teams that are grouped around them, I think that's going to be a major sign that this team absolutely is legit. But I want to be a little bit more cautious. I'm known for not overreacting on this channel. I still think top 6 is more than fair for Fnatic, and I think, you know, that range of like Heretics, Vitality, Fnatic, and even Koi coming in at number 7, they're all so close in terms of ranking for me that I don't think wherever you want to rank them, I understand. But Koi coming in at 7, not a great week, but honestly, they mostly moved down because other teams around them were just really good. Fnatic had to move up, Heretics had to move up, and somebody had to move out of top 6. And for me, that was Koi. You've got Astralis moving down to number 8. I felt they were really shaky this week, and I'm very concerned about what happens if teams continue to try to target ban them and if they don't go for the same strategy. Every game, I'm worried about what will happen in terms of the way they play the game, but they do have talent, and I still think that they deserve to be respected. So that's my top 8, but bottom 2 feel pretty locked in as well. SK dropping down to number 9. They just don't feel very good right now. As much as I love Exakick, the rest of this team does not feel solid. And then Excel at number 10. They are so clearly the worst team in the league. There's just nowhere else for them to go, so they stay at number 10. But of course, this is going to be controversial. Your list is probably going to be different than mine, so let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. Who am I overrating? Who am I underrating? I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback, of course. Time to get into Player of the Week and Dud of the Week in week number 1. Player of the Week, it's not a surprise. I'm going to try to build suspense, but my Player of the Week in week number 1 is going to go to Flakked, the AD carry for Team Heretics. This is just such a no-brainer. The dude is absolutely cracked right now. Played out of his mind in the first week of the season. If he's able to keep this up, it's a no-brainer MVP from him, especially if Heretics can make a playoff run. That would be massive, but Flakked played like a man possessed this week, was given a ton of resources and paid it back 100 times over, and so absolutely, there really was no other, like, actual option for Player of the Week here. I think that there were a lot of good players that, you know, played this week. Someone like Chasey, I think, definitely deserves mention, but this really could only go to Flakked. And then Dud of the Week was also a relatively easy decision for me as well. I'm going to give Dud of the Week to Abbedagge, the mid laner for Excel. Excel was just a disaster in general this week. They were clearly the worst team in the league, and I felt Abbedagge was definitely the one that was the most noticeable in terms of those collapses. He had moments like the, you know, the Baron fight in that final game, but still, missing an Annie ultimate in a pivotal team fight, like, that's disastrous, and he got clapped in lane basically every single game. So for me, Dud of the Week in week number 1 is going to go to Abbedagge. Player of the Week is going to go to Flakked, but that's going to do it. I really do hope you guys enjoyed. Of course, if you did, let me know down in the comments section below. What players are you excited about? What teams are you excited about? What teams are you disappointed by? I want to hear your thoughts and feedback on the LEC in general down in the comments section below. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, hit that like button. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content. Also, of course, it helps get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. And of course, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. I post about the LEC every single week, and we're going to be getting into the group stage and the playoffs eventually. You're going to want to stick around for that, but I don't only post about the LEC. I post about all 4 of the major regions as well as the NACL every single week on this channel. So if you're interested in comprehensive coverage concerning all of LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit that subscribe button and hit that bell to be notified when those videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.